every day here, we of course report on the latest coronavirus case numbers and also try to bring you stories of how this crisis is impacting people and workers all over the world. And even if it sometimes feels that way, given by the media presentation, this pandemic is not actually all about President Trump.
That's the conclusion the New York Times media columnist Ben Smith writes, quote, "The briefings are important. Mr. Trump is important. But the big story of the year, of this decade, is the coronavirus. And this isn't a story about Mr. Trump, and there's no reason to cover it that way." So Ben joins us now via Skype for more. We're happy to have him. Ben, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. As you know, very impressed with what you guys are up to.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that.
Ben, tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this column. What is it, the dynamics of the media coverage that you think are missing, and so what's being overcovered in this current crisis?
You know, I mean, it was sort of another day of Trump attacking a journalist, that becoming this sort of central story, this clash between Trump and a reporter. And I was sort of thinking about it and realizing I had forgotten which reporter he attacked, even though it was somebody I'm pretty close to, and also which day of the week it was and what Trump was talking about. And I think, there's this sort of heated debate about the briefings and that I think lacks a kind of proportionality. And having run BuzzFeed and thought a lot about how you cover, how do you balance different events of different importance when you don't have a front page, you don't have a magazine cover, you're not limited in space in a way that forces you to say, this is the most important story, this is the second most important story. You've got to have some kind of internal sense of proportion. And it's not that the briefings aren't A, incredibly entertaining, B, a really important historical document. When people look back in this era and what the hell was happening, they're going to watch those briefings. But if you want to understand what the United States federal government response is to coronavirus, watching the briefings and live tweeting them isn't really the best way.
Right.
Yeah. Right. And so why do you think that the media has fallen into this framing the whole crisis around what Trump is doing or who he's beefing with or what he said in the briefings? Again, acknowledging all of those things are important. He is the president of the United States, but not every story centers around Donald Trump is good or Donald Trump is bad. Why do you think that some have fallen into that trap?
I mean, it makes for great television. And I do think there is this impulse to confront him. And he, by the way, leaders of his kind of authoritarian style around the world use these confrontations with journalists to prove their strength. And there are confrontations that happen on their turf where he's behind the podium up on the stage and everybody else is sitting in little chairs. It's a kind of reality television that he's producing. Not to say that journalists aren't right to ask tough questions, but again, the most important story about Donald Trump isn't happening in the briefing room. It's the reporting on the actions of his federal government, many of them driven by really grievous errors he made early on, many others that really don't have that much to do with him, like the CDC testing failures. Mm-hmm. And then there's a huge range of actors around the world in the United States with an impact on the outcome of coronavirus, of whom, and this is partly because of his weakness as a president, of whom he is really only one.
Right, and Ben, one of the things I think I'd seen was that one of the ways that made cable news worth watching in the Katrina era was just the sheer amount of correspondence, the actual coverage of what the FEMA response looked like, and people then took that response and extrapolated it to President Bush. So much of that seems to be missing here. Is that a way in which the cable has consolidated? Is it just the new normal in the Trump era? I mean, I guess my real question is, was it a discrete choice that cable news made in order to stop covering things that way? Because they certainly know how to do so and have effectively done so in the past.
Yeah, when you think about television and when television can be meaningful and important, it's when it is out in the field bringing you something you could not otherwise see. I mean, Vietnam is obviously the sort of prime example of American people seeing what was happening there and changing their view on the war. And yes, in Katrina, the TV was not about briefings with President Bush. It was about horrible things happening in New Orleans. I think that there are a number of factors. One is just that it's so much cheaper to produce in studio, and so most of the cable networks, particularly Fox, also MSNBC, actually CNN least of all, have given up most of their correspondents, don't have the capacity to produce outside studio. But I think they've trained their viewers and found ratings and just having people yell at each other in the studio. Trump is in some ways like the highest version of that. It's disappointing. You would rather see particularly CNN with this vast network of really great journalists around the world and around the country, finding doctors and hospitals willing to give them access, as you've seen the BBC in particular, and occasionally CNN and others do, and bring coverage from the front lines of the actual crisis.
Yeah. Well, and so do you see it as a sort of broader indictment of the media during the Trump era? We often quote Matt Taibbi, is another friend of the show here, saying that like the way that the media changed their approach after doing some soul searching when Trump won the presidency was like, instead of doing 1,000 hours of Trump, we're going to do 1,000 hours of Trump is bad. And so not just with this crisis, but you see stories that are important, like the teachers strike, wave of teachers strikes that, was really unprecedented in our history, really undercovered because there isn't kind of a Trump angle to it. Other stories like the fights with journalists, vastly overcovered because number one, it's like this insular navel gazing. Number two, you've got this great perfect villain who drives ratings. I mean, do you see this as a broader dynamic throughout the Trump era?
First of all, I'm not sure I'm a friend of the show. Maybe an enemy of the show. I think it's like TV. So, I think it's hard. I think it's easy for us to say, and for media critics to say, this is easy, this is how I would have done it. I mean, Trump is this magnetic, incredibly compelling figure who people want to watch. And that is ultimately why TV is pointing cameras at him. And it's very hard for, and that's, that's an American problem. That's not a TV production problem. So I think there's a lot going on, a lot of different factors at play.
Yeah.
But I do think.
And how do you get out of that, though? Because what you're pointing to is basically, look, the ratings are good, right? And some TV executives even admitted that after he was elected president. Was like, well, maybe terrible for the country, but it's great for our bottom line. How do you get out of that trap as long as the bottom line is the bottom line?
I think that's a really hard question. I mean, I think that a lot of these are the choices that kind of viewers are going to make around what they want to see. I do think if you look at local news, which is actually where most Americans consume news, you have seen a shift in recent weeks. And I've been looking at kind of local coverage around the country from this sort of Washington-centric discussion of the federal response and what Trump is saying to like bad things that are happening in my community. And I think when you think about Trump's numbers with old people moving, I think that's one of the things that's happening.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic. To that point, actually, Ben, I wanted to take it back to your very first column at the Times, something I really loved. You talked about how the success of the New York Times might be bad for journalism writ large, and we've also seen now a collapse of local news industries. Could you talk a little bit about that, the effect of coronavirus on the business model for many of these places where Americans do consume news and it's just being hollowed out right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that coronavirus, in a lot of industries is also, in some sense, preying on the already weakened elements of the industry. And the local newspaper business has been in an sort of increasingly rapid decline for years. And you've just seen this just catastrophe over the last few weeks and months of newspapers laying people off, shutting down, furloughing people. I mean, if you're relying on advertising from local restaurants and movie theaters and car dealerships, you're in huge trouble. And I don't really see a path out for a lot of these companies that were already very much on life support. But what it does mean is you're just fewer and fewer resources to cover not what Trump is saying, but what is happening at the local the local assisted living facility where the bodies are piling up.
Right.
Yeah. And so last question for you. I mean, on coronavirus and how it should be covered, like what are the specific segments that you would like to see? How would you like to see the coverage shift specifically?
I think that there's an opportunity to spend more time covering what is happening in the country and the kind of range of actors and federal responses. I mean, I think these scrambles by governors to get protective equipment, sometimes being foiled by the federal government, is an incredible story. And I think what ultimately the most important voices and the most trusted voices are doctors and epidemiologists. And I think you are seeing more and more of that as the sort of reality sinks in here. And I think, the President of the United States is an important person, and he's the president. And I don't think that the idea that you can kind of black him out and wish him away doesn't really make any sense to me. And I think he should, you should cover the briefings, you should challenge him. But I think there has to be some sense of proportion about what's happening here and what the most important and central story is. And it's not what comes out of Donald Trump's mouth every day.
Right. The balance is the most important part. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.